to our leaders within the organisations we work for about what we do in data. Myself, I'm a data professional. I've been working in data for a long time, more than 20 years. I remember when CSVs were the only form of data. No, just jokes. So one of the cool things about today is that we're going to see and hear from Mo and from Alan. We're going to get a demo of the new product suite from Immuta. So we're actually going to see some cool stuff that I don't think a lot of people would have seen. And Immuta is really special in the fact that it focuses on attribute-based access control. Now, everyone's talked about role-based access control till they're blue in the face. Yeah, that is yesterday. The future and the way to actually fine-grainedly control data when you're sharing it within your organisation or within an external organisation is to use attribute-based access control. I'm not the expert on this, so I'm not going to talk too much more about it. I'm going to hand over to Mo, who's flown in from the States for us, and he's here this week, so big warm welcome for Mo. And I will let him tell you the story of exactly why he's here.
Yeah. Alan is actually the expert, so I'm just here to introduce him. But no, I'm excited to be here. I'm Moritz. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Immuta. I will do a couple of slides talking about security and privacy and a couple of things, and obviously data. And then we'll do a demo, which is much more interesting, and show the product and show you how easy it is to actually do data governance and data security in a good way. And meet the security team. If you have any questions, please feel free to just interrupt. I know we have Q&A time later, but if we want to make this a little bit more interactive, just raise your arm, shout, and we can have a discussion, especially if you disagree with something. That's always good. You can find me on Twitter. I think I'm the last person on there. But if you want to follow me there, we can do that. Maybe I should put my Facebook threads or whatever the other thing is on there. But more seriously, so data security is obviously a little bit of a scary topic. Whenever I do a talk like this, I usually just Google to see what's the latest data breach that's in the news and how many days ago it happened. And I think there was an article in the New York Times last week. Because you know all of that, right? There are more and more data breaches, right? This one is about the US, right? There's a little bit of a conflict between China and the US, so right, there's a lot going on. And there are more and more breaches. There's always more and more data in the cloud, which is great, but it also just provides a bigger and bigger attack surface, and everybody's using more and more tools. And there are more and more people accessing data, which is also great. I think that's great. But if you look at it through a security lens, it just means more risk, right? More people in your company accessing data, especially sensitive data, means more risk if you talk to a CISO or a security professional, because they just think about all the things that can go wrong. So there are more and more breaches, not just in the US, right? There's a lot that happened also in Australia. You've probably seen some of those things, right? And it won't stop, right? We will only see more of that simply because if you look at what's happening in the world, right? You have bad actors. They're just going after companies and are trying to extort money and all of that. But then you also have nation state conflicts, right? Obviously Ukraine in Europe, right, is very top of mind for some people. But there's just so much conflict in the world where we'll only see more of those attacks will happen, and it means that there's more and more data, right, that gets out, that gets leaked, and so you need to think ahead of it. If you are a data professional, if you are a data engineer, if you are a data scientist, because the security organization in your company is definitely thinking about that, and all of that is top of mind for them, right? So if you don't make a step towards them, they will make many big steps towards you, but not in a fun way. Because, right, every time you talk with the security team, the answer is usually no, right? Can we use this new tool? Can we use that new tool? Can we try this new cloud data warehouse or data lake? The answer is no, right? So if you don't make a step towards them and work with them and learn to speak their language, they will dictate what you can do, and then most likely it will suck, right? It won't be the tools you want to use. It won't be the newest and greatest technology. So you need to work with them. And what I always like to show is, I don't know if you have heard about those two cases, but when you think about, right, like why are security professionals, why is that other side always like so stubborn, and why can they only say no, and why don't they allow us to do anything? What's happening now, at least in the US, is there were some high profile cases where there were data breaches. And then in one case, the CISO got held accountable, which makes sense, right? CISO is the person ultimately that's accountable in many organizations if something like that happens. But then the other thing that happened is there was a company that actually Uber bought where there was a data breach. CEO got held accountable. And now in the next company that he will join or start, he has to implement certain controls. So it's basically that what happened is following him around. And so there's a lot of like that momentum when you look at the regulators, and I'm pretty sure the same will happen ultimately also here in Australia, where the regulators get more and more aggressive when it comes to data breaches, right? Because I think it's ultimately good. There's so much more data about all of us, right, that companies have. They need to protect it. And if they don't protect it, right, there will be consequences. And those consequences will not only impact the companies, they will also impact the individuals. And when you like really internalize that, right, then it's no surprise, right, when you talk to the security team that their answer is no, right? Because they know about that. And for them, all of that is top of mind. So I always try to remember that when I talk with our CISO, because I usually hear no as an answer, right? And I try to like figure out, well, how can we use data better, right? How can we look, right, and take advantage of all the exciting stuff that's currently happening around large language models and other things, right? Usually the answer from security or compliance is like, well, you can't, right? You can't do anything. So keeping that in mind and making a step like towards them is really important, because what ultimately complicates everything even more is, right, there's more and more privacy regulation. So it's not only about security, right? When you think about security, security is, right, like how do you make sure that there are no bad actors that can steal data, do other bad things, right? Like how can you make sure that nobody from outside the company can get in and steal information, steal data? When you think about privacy, right, it complicates the picture further, because it's about all the data that you already have that you want to leverage because you want to build a data product, you want to implement a data mesh, or you want to train a model, right? You have a lot of data, but you still need to think through, well, how can we use all the data? What are we allowed to use, right? How can we stay compliant? So all the privacy regulations in Australia, but also what's happening, right, in the US, we have CCPA, in Europe, you have GDPR, right? There are all those regulations that ultimately then dictate what you can really do with the data. And so that really complicates the picture quite a bit. And that is why I'm pretty sure, right, in all the companies you work, there's like a lot of pressure ultimately to make sure that data is being used in a compliant manner, which I think is ultimately good, right? When I think about the data that companies have about me, I want them to use it in the right way. But as a data professional, it's utterly like frustrating because you want to leverage data and do great things with it, because you see all the upside, right, and all the cool things you can do. And if you can't do that, it's frustrating. So one last, and I promise this is like the last screenshot I will show from a newspaper. Because I think, right, I'm pretty sure, right, you are all interested in what's happening with, right, generative AI and large language models and all of that. I think it's super exciting. But then when I put like my data security or privacy hat on, all I think about is, oh my God, there will be more regulation. And it will probably start in Europe, because the European Union is like very afraid of technology right now, unfortunately. So they will regulate the heck out of it. And then it's just another thing, right, that comes on top of all the other, right, regulations that are already out there and all the other controls. And so I feel like it gets harder and harder to work with data and do cool things with data. Now, like putting all of that aside, right, like that is what's top of mind for, right, the CISO, for the person running the security organization or responsible for privacy or compliance, right? I think it's important for everybody working in data to keep that in mind, because that's the reason why they, right, say no, or why they want you to do certain things. And they don't speak your language, right? So when I think about, and I stole this, I think, from Andreessen Horowitz, did anybody, you probably have seen this, right? It's like, no, I stole it off the internet. Good, so, but I didn't come up with it, right? But when you think about like how you are using data, right? And everything that goes into from like pulling data out of different source systems, collecting them, like putting them into a lake or into a warehouse, right? Manipulating it, transforming them, and then making it usable. And the same in like the context of machine learning, right? It's really complex, and that is the world you understand. But it's not the world that a security professional or a compliance or a privacy person understands, right? So that's part of the problem, right? We don't speak the same language, right? You are super familiar with all of that, know all the tools, right? Know how to build models or data products depending on what you're doing, or data pipelines. But like a security professional, right, or a privacy person, or somebody who defines like policies, right, in your company and writes like a document on what you're allowed to do with data, they don't understand that, right? So we're not speaking the same language. And that's really hard. And it gets more and more complicated because, like, anybody saw this? It's my favorite. Because, right, we had this like whole hype around the modern data stack, which I think it's good that there are so many tools, right? Because ultimately, you should pick the best tool for the job, right? Could be open source, could be like a product that you buy. You can build your own tool. I think it's good if there's like choice, right? If you decide what do you use to do your job, right? And get the job done. But then all of that, right? Again, it's like super complex if you have all those tools, because a security person is like, well, every single logo up there just increases risk. Every additional tool you use, every additional open source project you pull into like whatever pipeline, it just increases the risk, right? So there's all this complexity that you might be able to deal with because you, right, pick all the different things out of this like graphic. And you think that's great and it helps you, right, do your job. But like on the other side, people are really afraid of that. So when we at Immuta think about, well, like with all of that in mind, right, how can we help both the security side, the compliance and privacy side in a company, but then also the data side? How can we help like you leverage data and you do your job while at the same time staying compliant and secure the data? We try to simplify it because we ultimately believe there's what we call the cloud data security dilemma, because there's a conflict, right? There's a conflict between people who want to leverage data because you are only focused on, and I'm focused on, right? Oh, like what can we do with the data? This is great with all this data. How can we leverage it, right? And I primarily think about how we can innovate, what we can do for our customers. The other side, is primarily worried about, well, how can we share as little data as possible, right? Like every single person that has access to data is like bad, right? Because zero trust, I think, is an overhyped term, but zero trust, right, as a mindset and methodology when it comes to security makes sense, right? Like if only half of you have access to, let's say, Snowflake, that's better than if all of you have access to Snowflake. Like it's that simple, right? Because the likelihood that one account will get compromised is pretty high, right? Because we all make mistakes. An account gets compromised, and through that you pull data out if you are a bad actor. So security wants to lock everything down, grant less access, right? And it's this binary discussion. But what we believe you can ultimately do is make it non-binary, right? Share maybe some data, share the last 4 digits of a credit card number, share maybe only 4 out of the 20 columns in a table, things like that. You can easily do with Immuta or also without Immuta if you want to build your own Immuta. But we believe there's like this happy middle path that's possible out there. And so I always like to simplify because, right, I don't like those like really complex slides. I try really simple, I like simple things. And so when you think about protecting data, where is ultimately most of the data sitting? It's like either, right, it's in a data lake or a warehouse, or if you build a data mesh, right, like use whatever terminology you want to use, right? But there is usually, right, there is a place where you have a lot of data sitting. And if it's in your, right, lake, you have lots of different sources ultimately, right, that push data into that lake. And then you have different systems, right, that take data out. That is when I try to simplify this like logo like slide. If I really try to simplify it down, right? You have a lakehouse or you have a lake, a warehouse or a lakehouse. I think that's Databricks terminology. And you have data going in, and then you have data going out. In the most simplified manner, right? Data going in could be, right, when I talk to some of our customers, right? They use SAP to manage their supply chain, pull data out of SAP, put it into Databricks or Snowflake or something else, and then they pull it out, right? And you have a Power BI, Tableau, whatever report, right? That's like super simple workflow, right? You might have, right, a transactional database like Postgres, you're pulling data out of that, you put it into the warehouse, and then you maybe push it into Salesforce, right? Or you use it in a Juniper notebook or whatever you want to do, right? Like you move data into your lake or warehouse, and then you take it out, or people take it out, they visualize it, they do reports, they build models, they do something with it. So how can you ultimately secure that and protect that? We believe it's actually very, very simple. There are different ways of doing it, but if you try to simplify, what we believe you should do is you should have a policy engine. And again, you can like do that without immuta, because I don't want to like say immuta is the only solution to do that, right? We will show you a demo and we will show you how easy it is. But what we learned from like working with all of our customers over the last like 10 years is the simplest way to do is you have a policy engine, and in that policy engine you define who can do what, right? What user can see what data. Ideally use attributes for that, right? So I have an attribute like US, or you have an attribute Australia, right? And depending on that, you can see different things. And you use that information and marry it with the metadata you have about your data, right? Is this BII? Is this BHI? Is this a credit card number? Is this a first name? And depending on that information in your policy engine, you define who can see what. Either because you write the code or you do it in the UI. And through that, you can control ultimately where the data is going and who sees the data. And we believe that's the simplest way of doing it. Because if you do it like that, you don't have to worry about all the data that's going into the warehouse, right? You can let everything in, right? You don't need to clean things up, or you might want to clean things up, but you don't have to take out BI because it can't be in the warehouse, because then people can access it. You can put all the BI in the warehouse, right? Don't worry about it when you have your pipeline pushing data into the warehouse. Because if you exclude data here, and then suddenly a month later somebody needs it, or there's maybe this one data scientist that is allowed to use it, like how do you get the data, right? You have to then go back, pull data out again, rerun the pipelines, all of that. Very, very cumbersome. So you should get comfortable just pushing as much data into the lake or into the warehouse. Also makes Databricks and Snowflake and all the vendors very happy, obviously, because you pay quite some money. But it is worth it because you can have all the data there, and then you protect through the policy engine who takes data out, right? And you protect through the policy engine what can leave a system like Snowflake, what can go into something like Tableau or Power BI or any other destination. And if that's the only point where you control it, it ultimately makes it very, 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 very simple for you to do that. And then you can decide, right? Maybe, right, a certain team, a certain group of people, a certain department can have more access, another one has less access, right? Maybe you mask like everything but the last 4 digits, right, of this credit card number for some people, but for others it's completely masked, right? You can do those things, and you can decide how much data can somebody see depending on who they are and what they do in the organization. And so it's not this binary decision anymore. And if you have that, and then, right, go to the security team and help them understand that you have all those controls in place, they won't say just no, right? Because they ultimately want to like help you and help the company, right? But if you don't bring a solution to them and understand that they need to see some sort of controls, right, they will freak out and say like, this is too risky, this is too dangerous, right? And if something goes wrong, it's my fault, right, as the CISO, and then I will be held accountable. Yeah, it's over. So before we go to a demo, because I think this is like all super abstract, right, and just slides and stuff like that, demo makes it much easier to understand. But really quick, the 3 things you ultimately need to truly secure your lake or your warehouse or whatever you want to call it is you need to understand what data you have, right? You need to have good metadata, right? You need to know, is this sensitive, is this not sensitive? How sensitive is it under a given regulation or internal rule, right? A first name or second name, right, is BII, right? Email address is BII. Like, you need to understand like what that data is, and you need to have high confidence in it. If you have that metadata, right, and if you know that this column has a credit card number, then you can leverage it in the policy engine to say, well, whenever you see a credit card number, let's control what happens with it. Somebody can see it, somebody else can't see it. So you need to have good metadata. That's the one side. The other side is you need to understand who is accessing what data. Because ultimately your security organization wants you to be able to prove that you protected everything, right? They love audits. Pretty sure we all love audits, right? Where you have to prove nobody accessed certain data. And you have to like pull out audit logs and all of that. You need a way to show, well, the controls we put in place really like made sure that nobody accessed the PII or the PHI or whatever sensitive data you have. Or maybe just like proprietary data, right, that you don't want many people in your organization to access. So those are the three things you need. We will do a demo. Alan was kind enough to do the demo because that allowed me to be on vacation last week and not break my demo environment, which is very, very nice. But we will do the demo, and that will, I think, make it a little bit easier to understand like what we mean and how simple it is, right, to put good controls in place, know what data you have, use that metadata to build policies, and then prove that you protected it. And then we can maybe do questions or Q&A and all of that.
Let me just re-log in before I begin. Those secure things. Yeah, I try to bypass them as much as I can. That's the picture. And we're up and running, thank you. So, thanks Mo for that. I'm Alan Clark, I'm a solution architect with Immuta. I'm based in Sydney, and this evening is kind of like what Mo was saying around the simplicity of using Immuta. I kind of want to, the next 20 minutes or so, demonstrate how we can connect to your data. We do the metadata, so we tag, classify, and how simple that process is. We'll go through how we understand who our users are, and then we'll also build a couple of policies in real time and show, what I want to kind of show is like data security sounds tough, but using Immuta is quite simple to do, and that's using a combination of policies. So there's two kind of personas that I see when I do my demos. One is that we have a person that will actually interact with the data. So they're the data engineer, your data scientist, your BI developer. And they just want the data. And they don't care about policies or what data they see. So they don't know that Immuta exists. They just access the data. And that will be the user. This evening, I'm going to run some queries in both Snowflake and Databricks, and that will be the end user. This is the user experience that person will see. And then within the Immuta console, I'm going to show how we can connect to a data platform. We register those data sources. We do discover, so we tag all the classified data, how we connect to your users, and then build a couple of policies and show the auditing of that. So again, we support like a lot of the major clouds like Snowflake, Databricks. And I break it into three sections. There's discover, so it's understanding what your data is. And then we have secure, which is actually building the policies. And then we have detect at the end, so we understand what we built is actually enforcing that. So I'll step through each of those. So please jump into any questions as we go through the session. So the first part you do is you mute as a SaaS instance and you point it at your data cloud, your lakehouse or your warehouse, and you register a connection between, say, Snowflake and Immuta. And you say, so that's like out of the box. You just point at Snowflake and then you say, I want to monitor a schema, or I want to monitor all tables in Snowflake. So if you have 5,000 tables or 10,000 tables, Immuta will register those as data sources in Immuta. And this is an example here. We do this for Databricks. And the first thing we do is we discover the data within. So we tag the data. And what that means is that we create the metadata. And this is kind of what Mo was speaking around, how you want a good metadata tagging of your data. And we do this at scale and automatically. So you don't have to manually go through and tag each of these. So what we do is we connect to each data source or table. We take a sample of that data, 1,000 rows. And we do this within the data platform. So none of your customer data, none of the data in your tables will ever leave your data environment. So none of your customer information will ever come to Immuta. So we take a sample of 1,000 rows and we run it through our sensitive data discovery process. And the output of the sensitive data discovery process is that we tag the data. So we do this automatically. So you can see that on this table, this client data table, we've identified email address, we identified PII, identified gender, identify credit card information, social security number, and location-based information as well. This is all out of the box, comes with Immuta. So I think at last time we came about 60 inbuilt classifiers, but you can build your own classifier. So if you had a specific customer ID or reference ID that you want, and it has to follow a certain pattern, like a leading 3 digits and 4 characters, you can write a classifier for that. And that's just a simple YAML file. You upload that to Immuta and say, when I find this information, I want to give it this tag information. And you do that at scale. So that allows you to build and customize your own classifications. So we tag all this information, and also with schema detection, schema detection, column detection. And as Mo was saying, as you add more and more data into Snowflake or your data platform, we'll automatically find that data. So you don't have to go and register these manually within Immuta. We'll automatically find them, either using a scheduled job, or you can build that into your data pipeline. So you can have API driven. But each time you add a new table to your data platform, we will do this exact process. We'll go through and tag it. So this is tagging at a column level. So we've gone through and tagged all this. And we also tag at a table level. So you can see that this table we've tagged it as owned being by Department Banking. It's in the production environment and it's curated. So we tag all that information, we give all that tagging. So that's kind of the tagging part of it. So we've gone through and discovered the data. So we're going to use this tagging information to build our policies. This is about object tagging. This allows you to scale. So the better your tagging is, the more fine-grained control around your tagging, the better your policies will be. But just before I move on to securing the policy, the second thing is your users. So we connect to like an IAM system like Azure Active Directory, Okta. Sorry. Oh, yes. Let me see. That's a comment. Is that any better? Yeah. So what we do is we connect to your IAM system. So that's the Azure Active Directory, and we pull in all that information. So I think this user here, this is the, when I spoke with, this is the user, the person that will be actually querying the data in Snowflake. And you can see they have all these attributes, Department Marketing, GDPR certified false, and they're part of the banking group. So what we've done is we've connected to your data, so we understand what data is in your tables from a metadata perspective. We understand who your users are. So this could be a person or it could be a service. So we now know what your data is and who your users are. So knowing the combination of both these, you can now go and start creating policies. And this is what we talk about secure. So this is actually building the policies. So let me log in again. So as Mo was saying, that you can actually build these policies in Snowflake yourself, or you can build them in Databricks. They have the capability to do this. So you could do all this by hand. So everything I'm showing you today, you could actually build within these platforms. What we're doing is we build the policies using plain English, so it's meant to be easier to understand. You don't require in-depth knowledge of how Snowflake does masking policies. You just build the policies with here, and then we connect to those platforms and we natively enforce them within those systems. And what that allows you to do is that you want to enforce your policies as close to the data as possible. So the policies are attached to your table. And the reason for that is, if you can remember back to Mo's slide, where you had all your consumers on the right-hand side, as long as they're using their ID and connecting to the data, irrespective of what type of client they're using, because the policy is enforced on the table, you can guarantee that if they connect via Power BI, if they connect through the notebook, you're given the same user experience because the policies are attached on the table. And this is something that we've kind of refined and learned over the years. This is the best way to manage it. It kind of aligns to what Mo was saying. So if I look now within Snowflake, so this user tries to query this data, this client data table. Yeah.
Does that translation happen when data leaves Immuta or before it leaves?
Sorry, you mean the policies are enforced?
Yeah.
So the policy, so it kind of both ways. When you activate a policy, Immuta will connect to the underlying platforms and apply the policies where the tagging is. And then as you onboard more data, as we detect new tables have been added, we'll identify what tagging is on that and apply the policies in real time on those tables. Did that answer your question?
Does it also import policies from the destination? Does that happen?
No, we use the bucket tagging. So you want to tag your data first, and then depending on what policies you built, we can enforce the rules based on those tags. Yeah. So my user, they try to connect to the client data table, and there's a policy saying don't give them access. So what we want to do now is write a policy to say I'm going to give this user access to this data. And we can do that using a subscription policy. So if you remember, this table, client data, is part of the banking group. So I want to write a policy going, if a user has a very simple example, like a group banking, I'm going to give them automatic access to data, and that's a policy that I want to write. So I can achieve that in immuta. So I'll just quickly add a subscription policy, and I'll give it a banking group data access. And from here, I can select what type of policy. So I won't go into all of them for just to time, but we do have, you can build policies to have like a data owner, like an approval request process. You can have access to all data, or you can individually select users. But what we encourage is allow user-specific groups or attributes. And this is what we call birthright access. So if a user satisfies a certain condition, we want to give them access to data immediately. So I select that policy type. And now I'm going to use the metadata of the user. So allow users to subscribe when is a member of group banking. So remember, my user is a member of the group banking. So that's using the end user metadata. And this is where do I want the policy to be enforced on. So I can select from here on data sources tagged. So I'm using the metadata on the table to identify which table I want this policy to be enforced on. And I'll just say department banking. And I create that policy. And I just activate that policy. So what's happening at this point is that the connection between immuta and Snowflake, we're actually going and connecting to Snowflake, and we're writing that policy into that. And for any table that's been tagged department banking, this policy will apply. This should happen in real time. So it takes probably takes about 10-15 seconds for this policy to be enforced on. But within Snowflake, if you looked at the query history, you'd see immuta connecting to it and enforcing the policies. So when we say native, we mean that when the user queries the data, there's no dependency in immuta at that time. So they will query the data and immuta will not be involved. And we do that for performance, because there's no dependency in immuta, and we're not adding any additional performance or degradation to your query because we're using the native inbuilt capabilities of that platform. So now if I go back to my Snowflake and run my query again, fingers crossed, now they have access to that data because my policy said if the user is banking, give them access to the data. So that's an example of giving access to the table. What I want to do next is I want to actually do a level below this to do FineGrain access control. So I could give everybody in this room access to this table, but depending on what our attributes are, our job title, seniority, contract type, what groups, we don't want people to see all this data. So we can see that this contains like credit card information, social security number, email. So I want to write a policy to say I don't want people to see email addresses. I only want people to see email addresses if they completed the GDPR certification. And I can achieve that within immuta using a data policy. So if I just quickly bounce back to the table, as part of our sensitive data discovery process, we've tagged this table with email address. We've done this automatically. So if you had 500 tables out of your data state that had email address, there's one policy applied to those 500 tables. So we're going to use this email address tag as part of our policy. So I'll just add a new data policy. I call it email masking policy. And from here, I'm going to select. So we give it a number of options. So we're going to have a masking policy. So we're actually going to take the value in a column and mask it. We can also do only show rows. We can do row level security, so only return a subset of the data. We can show date by time. So if you want to have a moving window of only showing the last 3 months of data, we can write that. We can do purpose-based access, or we can minimize data sources. But for this one, I'll just use a masking policy. So I'll say mask columns tagged. And then now from here, I'll just take electronic. So email address. It's important to note here, I'm not actually writing the policy to a specific technology or table. I'm writing towards tags, and this allows the scalability, as Mo was saying earlier. So I'm going to mask columns tagged email address, and from here I can select masking types. So this is where we talk about usability of data. So you don't want to lock it down and just make everything masked. You want to show data, but still allow some usage of it. So from here I can select which masking type I want to use. So we can use hashing, so we can run to SHA-256. We can make it a null, we can make it a constant, you can use a regular expression if you only wanted to show the portion after the @ symbol. We can also do k-anonymization, randomized response. You can also even call out your customized function if you want to do as well. So I'll just use hashing for the moment. So that's I'm using the metadata of the table. And the second part is this logic of when I want to give the user access to this data. Because obviously, some people have to see email address, but not everybody. So from here, I can say for everyone except when, I'm going to say possesses attribute. And if I look at, and I can search from here, GDPR certified true. So what this is saying is that if you have not completed your GDPR certification, we're not going to show you email address. We're going to show you a shard instance of that as well. So I'm going to, and now this is going to apply to any data source with email address. I add that, create that policy, activate that. Again, this is now pushing that data into that environment. What I also want to show is that not only do I have a Snowflake table registered, I also have a Databricks table registered as well. So that one policy, I didn't actually select, my cluster is not running, but that policy applied to both the Snowflake table and Databricks table. So now if I rerun my policy again, hopefully it's been enforced. It takes a couple of seconds. Rerun it again. We now see that the email address is now hashed out because that user didn't have that attribute. So that's an example of now we've given the user access to the table. We've said we're not going to show them email address because they haven't created the GDPR certification. But now I see that on this far right-hand column contains state information. So I want to say, well, I only want to show this user certain US states because they may only be aligned to certain states, so I only want to show them certain states. And this is an example, I think, is a good example of what we call attribute-based access control. So where, particularly if you want to write role-based access control. So consider that you think how you would build a policy to say, I want user to only access table data from California and Texas. How would you do that? Maybe create a group called California, create a group called Texas, and add them to both those groups. Perfect. What if they now have to manage 5 groups? You have to add them to 5 different groups and update your policy for that. And then if they leave your organization, you have to make sure you remove them from all these groups. It becomes quite challenging. It's called road bloat. But using immuta is what we call attribute-based access control. We can do this quite simply. I can show you an example of that. So again, I'll create a policy. And I'll give it a state policy. And I'm going to do only show rows this time. So only show rows where, and I'm going to possess attribute. And I'm going to go state. So if I just quickly touch on my user, we can see that this user now is state Utah. So what I want to say, when this user queries the data, I'm only going to show them rows for Utah. So I'm going to say, only show rows where user possesses an attribute state that matches the values in the column. And as part of our sensitive data discovery process, we found state information. And I'll do this for everybody. And this is an apply on any data sources tagged state. I'll create that policy. But just while that policy is being enforced, I just want to show that although I'm showing quite simple versions of policies, you can make these as complex as you wish. You can add more conditions so you can build nested hierarchical type policies. The ones I'm showing is quite simple, but you can actually build really complex policies quite simply using the policy builder. And the same applies for on data sources. So I might say on data sources tagged with state, and I can add other circumstances going in server. I can actually specify where I want this to run. So it's quite granular. So now if I rerun my query, hopefully it takes time, we should only see Utah information. Yeah, so in real time, we've done the row level security policy. So consider now that this user is now moved to add an additional state. All we need to do is update their attributes. I'm not actually modifying the policy. I'm not making any changes to the policy. So if I add an attribute Texas, so again, this type of user information will be done in your IAM system to move groups, move attributes. All this will be done upstream. Immuta has that schema integration with those systems. We pull all their information in, and in real time, we enforce that data. Rerun my query again. Takes a couple of seconds for it to propagate across, about 10-15 seconds. So now we can see both Texas and Utah information there. So probably in the last, 10-15 minutes we've been here, I've been able to show how we've been able to write policy to allow user access to data. We're able to show how we're able to, based on quite simple logic, to mask an email, and also to do row level security. So again, any table you add moving forward that contains email address. This policy will automatically be applied. Any table that we identify state information, we can apply the policy to it. So you kind of build the policy once, and then as you onboard more data, reinforce those policies automatically. So that allows you to scale and grow quite quickly. Any questions? Yeah?
Does deny take precedence over allow, or does that depend on the underlying source, like Databricks or how they interpret?
Yeah, so what we've found is that when you're writing the policy, it's kind of by exception first. It kind of strengthens your security posture to build it that way. But you can build the policies to say, I want to allow everyone in part for this, or do the exception from that. Does that answer your question?
No.
Sorry.
I'm asking, say there are conflicting policies.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
One is allow, one is deny.
Yep.
So what takes precedence?
So, yeah, it's a good question.
Or does that depend on the underlying data source, how that interprets?
The policy conflict will be identified using the combination of what policies you built and what tagging you've enforced. And in immuta, I'll just show you here, and you can see that there's policies here on the left-hand side, this column here. So we wouldn't allow you to get to a position where you have conflicting policies. We'd flag it going, this policy is conflicting this policy, and we'd raise that with the appropriate data owner to say, we've identified there's a policy conflict here, you need to resolve this before you apply your policy. So the idea is that you don't get into that state where you say, show everyone a banking credit card and then show anybody in banking, don't show them credit. You want to avoid that situation. You use this policy conflict within the UI to understand.